Dennis Green was the first. In 1981, a down-and-out Northwestern program made Green the first African-American head coach at any program in a traditional power conference. 1 year later, he was named Big Ten Coach of the Year. And while Green may have cracked open the door for coaches of color on the major college level, nearly 40 years later, actually walking through that door remains a challenge. And for those who don't find success quickly, that same door often hits them on the way out and locks permanently behind them. 14. That's the number of African-American head coaches at the FBS level. 14 out of 130, less than 11%, down from an all-time high of 19 set 9 years ago. In a sport where roughly half of the players are black, why is it that, after all these years, so few of them look to the man at the front of the room and see someone who looks like them? Part of it may be who's doing the hiring. For as low as that coaching total is, it's actually higher than the percentage of black Division I ADs, which totals less than 9%. Part of it may be the lack of a pipeline. First-time head coaches almost invariably come from the coordinator ranks. And while those numbers look a little bit better, they are hardly overwhelming. At the Power 5 level, a shade less than 18% of those positions are filled by African Americans. Part of it may be a lack of patience, as when those coaches defy the odds and do get a chance, they are often judged far more harshly. The average tenure for a white Power 5 coach is nearly 7 years, while the average black coach gets half of that time. And part of it may be the lack of second chances. Amazingly, in the history of the game, just 4 black head coaches have ever gotten a Power 5 job after previously getting fired as a college head coach. 4. Ever. Need some perspective on that number? It is equal to the number of white head coaches in the SEC this season who were fired from a previous gig. One of those 4, by the way, is Maryland's Mike Locksley, one of the 4 African-American head coaches in the Big Ten this season. The Pac-12 has 5, meaning outside of those 2 leagues, less than 5% of the FBS head coaches are black.
Guys, those numbers are absolutely staggering, and I think we all kind of know, well, there's still a major issue here, but to see it put in such stark terms as that was incredible to me. Howard, how do we change this?
You know, it's a difficult question, Reverend, and I think one of the things that ultimately has to change is, who's making the hires, what input they have. I think until there's a mindset, there's a change of the people that are making, the committees that are making these decisions, nothing ultimately is going to change, because it's a lot like the NFL ranks. If you're not in the pipeline, if you're not in the know, you're not going to be considered. And sometimes, listen, these search firms are a big part of it, and they control a lot of what's going on. And normally, like at the professional level, you hire people that are like you. And it's difficult sometimes to go outside of the box. But I think ultimately, until people start to continue to go outside of the box, not just once, but twice or 3 times, to make decisions that may be uncomfortable, nothing is ultimately going to change. But hopefully we can get to a point where they start to feel uncomfortable and they start to look at, listen, just because of a person doesn't look like I look, doesn't mean that they can't be successful at the job we want to hire them for.
No, I agree with that 100%. And a lot of it really does come down to those pipelines, too. And you look at the way that these programs are built. Obviously, you hire the head coach, but the head coach gets control of hiring the assistant coaches. But then you look at positions like GAs and quality control. And I think that's where you can make a concerted effort to really look at some qualified people. I've seen a lot of times where coaches will fill the GA quality control positions with, some people that they used to coach with, or, their friends' sons, or even their own children at times. And that's a form of affirmative action for people who have the ability to make the decisions like that. So there should be a concerted effort for an affirmative action type of program to at least look at more qualified people who can fill those roles, because the GAs are going to be the ones that are getting promoted to on-field position coaches, so on and so forth. But then you look at a guy like Tony Alford from Ohio State, for example, been a running back coach for 25 years in college football, played running back in college, but that's a hard position to be in and then become a coordinator or a head coach. Running back coaches usually aren't the ones, and he's done a great job throughout his career. He's been a recruiting coordinator. He's been an assistant head coach. So he's a very valuable guy to the program. It's just about finding a way to get a coach like him who provides value, who's been multiple wonderful places, Notre Dame and Ohio State, and get him into a position where he can become a coordinator and he can take that next step after being a coordinator and become a head coach.
Yeah, I've had a little bit of experience with both issues that Howard, you raised, and Joshua. As far as search, Howard, I've done 3 searches in recent years, and Floyd Keith used to run the Black Coaches Association that was located in Indianapolis. It is since disbanded because of lack of funding, but I would go to Floyd when I was getting ready to do a search, and he has a report card that he would like everyone to follow, and I would make sure that I would bring that information back to the athletic director and strongly advise and sometimes convince the athletic director to consider the formula that Floyd was showing. Joshua, when you talk about assistant coaches, to me the biggest thing is, why doesn't the staff reflect the racial makeup of the team? And why can't everybody on the team look at the leadership and see someone that looks like them? The Big Ten actually is probably ahead of the curve here. The average, and this is just the research I could do, and this isn't official numbers, but the research I found is the average black assistant coaches out of 10 is 4 in the Big Ten. Interestingly enough, Lovie has 8 black assistant coaches. Mike Locksley has 6. James Franklin has 5. Michigan State has 4. Obviously, they all have black head coaches. And when you talk about hiring analysts and hiring people in the back room and hiring young people, that's really what it's going to take. The other thing is, let's not underestimate the recommendations of a head coach. That I have this assistant, I have this black assistant that is ready to be a head coach, ready to be an offensive coordinator. Now you see Mike Locksley forming the National Coalition for Minority Football Coaches. That's progress. I mean, that's being part of the solution, not part of the problem. So it's getting as many assistant coaches, coaching staffs that reflect the racial balance of our teams.
One of you guys brought this up on our call this week. I think it was Joshua who mentioned Ryan Day. And you think about how Ryan Day got the Ohio State job, which was essentially Urban Meyer had him on the staff, and went to Gene Smith and said, this is the guy. He's never been a head coach before, and he gets one of the handful of best jobs in the country. Would a minority coach have gotten that opportunity with Ryan Day's resume? I think that's a really interesting question. And again, that's not to say he shouldn't have been Ohio State's coach. He's fabulous. There's no question about it. But I don't subscribe to the belief that there's one coach for every program. I don't know whether you guys do. Maybe there are a few rare exceptions where there's a guy who, Bill Snyder just seems to have the magic. Greg Schiano just seems to have the magic at Rutgers. But I think that's really fascinating about what it takes to get hired and what those resumes look like, Howard.
Yeah, I think not only is that important, Trevor, but I think it's also important that people have patience. And that's part of the problem. And you mentioned this in your lead-in, that a lot of times African-American coaches aren't given the time to turn around a program if it's a struggling program. Because the first thing we have to admit is they're not getting the greatest jobs that are out there. You mentioned Ryan Day and you talk about Ohio State. That is one of the best jobs in all of America, if not when you talk about being able to coach that program as a head football coach. A lot of times those jobs aren't open. You're in a job and you get a job that you have to build. You have to take time to put that foundation together to have a successful program. And so many times they're not given that opportunity, and that's unfortunate.
Howard, I can tell you one issue why the time is so limited. If you've ever interacted with Board of Supervisors or Board of Regents, I mean, they to a lot of extent look nothing like the players on the team. And they have the power. And if there's a black coach that has been there 3 years and hasn't had a lot of success, and the pressure from the people that the president and the athletic director ultimately report to, those people lose patience very quickly.
Let me say this, Coach, and I'm going to mention this, because it's about James Franklin and Penn State. That's a great job, But I guarantee you, there are a lot of people out there right now that think James Franklin should not be coaching at Penn State because of the struggles. But just discounting everything that he's done in the previous years. But right now, because they're going through a struggle, they think, well, he's not the right guy. He shouldn't be there. And nothing is further from the truth. He is an outstanding leader. Are there issues right now? Yeah, there are issues. But you have to give them the opportunity to work through those issues.
Yeah, that's the best point that's been made, in my opinion, what you just said about James Franklin. I'm sorry, Joshua.
No, I was just going to kind of jump in and say this. You know, we're having this conversation right now. We're talking about solutions. And one of the things I think has to be made clear here is that we're not saying that anybody should hire a coach because he's a minority. What we're saying is you have to look at all the qualified people. I look at Gene Smith at Ohio State, and he hasn't hired a black football coach, hasn't hired a black basketball coach, but he's made great hires. He hires a guy who's most qualified to do the job, which I can appreciate. I don't know if everybody else goes through all of the qualifications and does the due diligence like a guy like Gene does, so it'd be really interesting here, but you're right. I mean, there are a lot of things up against it. Obviously, getting your resume out there, the recommendations, and then the time it takes to become successful. We've seen these builds. They're very, very slow. You got to recruit. You got to change the culture. You got to get people to buy in, and if you can't even get the athletic department, the Board of Regents to buy in, it's going to be really hard to do your job.
It's clear it's systemic. That was the big thing that stood out to me as we talked about this and researched some of the numbers. You can't just point to one thing. There's so many factors, and you guys touched on a lot of them. Really, really fascinating stuff.